and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Sunday the 9th of January and this is the Full Scottish. I'm Andrew Wilson and today I'm hosting the programme from our studios in Glasgow. Firstly, I'll give you a short coronavirus update, then I will introduce today's two fantastic guests, and then together we will consider and discuss the top headlines from the news from around the world and Scotland from the past week. With regard to the coronavirus update, as at 2 p.m. yesterday, Saturday, there were 12,602 new confirmed cases of COVID-19. That means that since the start of the pandemic, a total of 1,037,665 people in Scotland have tested positive for COVID. On Saturday, there were 1,362 people who were in hospital with recently confirmed COVID-19, 48 of whom were in intensive care. I'm afraid to say that there were 26 new reported cases of deaths of people who had tested positive for COVID-19, and that means that in total 9,931 patients who tested positive for COVID have sadly died. As at Saturday yesterday, there were 4,390,076 people who had received their first dose of COVID-19 vaccination, 4,041,550 who had received their second dose, and 3,082,231 who had received their third or booster dose. Now, as I say, we're lucky enough to be joined today by two fantastic guests. Firstly, we have joining us Kaukab Stewart, MSP, who's now the MSP for Glasgow Kelvin. Kaukab was a teacher for more than 30 years and has been representing Glasgow Kelvin since the Scottish election in May 2021. Kaukab, good afternoon. How are you?
Good afternoon. I'm very well. I'm looking forward to the programme.
Well, we're very grateful to you for joining us today. Thank you, Kaukab. And we're also joined today by Joyce McMillan. Joyce is the theatre critic of The Scotsman and also writes political and social commentary and columns for that newspaper. She's been a political and arts columnist and a theatre critic and a broadcaster for quite a long time. Joyce, good afternoon. How are you?
Hello, hi.
Well, thank you.
How am I? I'm one of the people, Andrew, who's had the worst cold in the world this week, and of course thought I had COVID, so sent off for a test, but it came back negative. I think it's just that really bad cold that's going around. So bear up, everyone who's got the snivels. It's probably not COVID, but get it checked.
Well, I'm in exactly the same boat, as you. So yes, I'm glad to hear. In a sense, I'm glad to hear it's only the cold, and I hope you stay safe and stay clear of COVID. What we'll do first is we will move first to the first story we have, and it'll be no surprise that COVID is the first topic that we'll be discussing this afternoon. There were reports yesterday in the Times newspaper of plans by the Westminster government to end the provision of free lateral flow tests within weeks. And as you might expect, perhaps rather more considered and careful governments such as the Scottish government and the Welsh government immediately objected and condemned the reported plans. The first thing that crossed my mind in connection with this, bearing in mind that this is not the first time that this story has been reported. I found it in the pages of The Guardian back in September 2021. But I was going to ask you, Kaukab, first of all, the appearance of this story in the Times yesterday, and it's been continued this morning by the Health Secretary in Westminster on the TV channels, the news channels this morning. Why do you think this story about ending the provision of free lateral flow tests, why do you think it's appeared in the press just now?
Well, I think that this sort of it gives an indication, I think, of the Conservative government down there, of their view that we're going to have to live with this virus. And they're trying to sort of manage people's expectations in a way, I suppose, of sort of limiting the facilities that we know, the mitigation things and the protective measures that we can take. I mean, personally, I think that it's totally wrong-headed because, I mean, at the same time, we're looking at the cost of living increases, families facing hardship, And one of the key messages that all the nations, actually, the four nations and across the world, we've been going on and on about how testing can help us not only to track, but also to help us protect us. So then to come in and say, actually, we're going to start charging for it, I mean, that's absolutely horrendous. It's a total mixed message. And I worry that there is a danger that people will sort of already start thinking ahead, and they'll be thinking, right, well, I won't try to get a test because I can't get it for free, because they're having to make decisions between paying the fuel bills or paying for food. And that is just dreadful. That is absolutely dreadful. The pandemic is not over, and the Conservative government seem to be trying to behave and drip feed this view that it is over, and it absolutely is not over.
Thanks, Kaukab. Certainly, I think when this story was floated back in September, as I say, one of the mayors in the north of England described ending the provision of free lateral flow tests as the diametric opposite of levelling up. So it does seem at odds with perhaps what the Prime Minister says, not necessarily what the Prime Minister does, but it seems at odds with what he says. Do you think that in terms of the politics of it, we know that this Westminster government seem to have an aversion to data and prefer anecdotes and impressions rather than actual hard data. If the provision of free lateral flow test kits if that's ended, do you think what do you think the impact of the loss of the data that's currently being gathered through the lateral flow system? What do you think will that accelerate the government's ability to say, oh, the pandemic's over, let's move on?
Yeah, and I think that that's been an indication, sort of like as we've gone along, I've sort of kept an eye on that. And I mean, the Scottish government, have had to make really, really difficult decisions. But I do think that overall, they have stuck consistently to the data and the expert advice that they have been getting. And that has meant, as I said, making difficult decisions that are quite hard to swallow by businesses, for instance, as well as individuals. But when you're able to back that up with sound evidence and sound data, then you're going along the right way of doing things because you've got the evidence for it. So you're quite right to point out that if you don't have the evidence and you don't have the data, then you can go along with more of your gut feeling. And a lot of what's going on at the moment is sort of bucking against what our natural human instincts are at the moment. We all want to get back to normal. We all want to, be at work if we possibly can be. The effect on our social, emotional, mental health and well-being. I can see that these are enormous pressures and sort of dilemmas that we are facing. But if we have the data to say, hang on a minute, we still need to have measures in place, then we can support the nation through it. Whereas with Boris Johnson, sometimes I do, it sounds a bit disrespectful, but it seems to be making it up as he goes along. And if the data doesn't support his view or his government's view on things, then it's like, well, let's just stop collecting the data. And I think that that's deeply irresponsible, deeply irresponsible.
The assertion that the current Prime Minister has spent his entire career making it up as he's going along, I don't think you'll find anybody objecting to that here this afternoon.
Indeed, and I also think that it's the point about one rule for one set of people and one rule for others. Most of us have actually stuck to the guidance and stuck to the rules at great inconvenience and great hardship. We've done that. Whereas, we keep reading articles in the paper and more stuff comes out. The very people who are making the rules for the rest of us to follow are actually not sticking to those rules themselves. So in a way, that to them, it doesn't matter, about the data because it's never mattered to them, in my opinion. It's a strong view, but they haven't followed that advice consistently themselves, and yet they've expected the population to do so. So thankfully, the majority of the population are far more responsible than the current UK government that we have.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kaukab. Now, Joyce, turning to you, this story, also looking at this story again through the prism of the media, this story of the proposal to end the provision of free lateral flow tests to the population, it emerged on the same day as we also learned that more than 150,000 people have died in the UK. And it struck me that those two messages appearing on the same day was curious, at least. And now, just so we can reflect for a moment, 150,000 people, that's the population of Dundee, that's the population of Perth and Inverness and Ayr combined. Or, thinking of where you grew up, it's the population of Paisley twice.
Yeah.
So, thinking of that in the context, and thinking of the lack of reporting of any response, any emotional response to that level of mortality in the UK as a result of the pandemic, I think it's the 7th highest death toll for any country in the world. Why do you think it is that that level of death in the UK is apparently so unremarkable?
Well, it's partly down to the media, undoubtedly. I mean, there's a huge swathe of the print media, the London-based print media, which was and is strongly supportive of Conservative government. They were strongly supportive of the Brexit project, which brought Boris Johnson to power, and they have no vested interest in pointing out just how poor Boris Johnson's management of the COVID crisis has been. So right from the start, there's been a tendency to talk as if other countries were having terrible death tolls and managing it really poorly. But even though Britain was facing difficulties, it was all somehow kind of manageable, and, you know, Blitz spirit and all the rest of it, and, you know, Captain Tom Moore walking up and down his garden, and that we would sort of get through it and it wouldn't be too bad. And the thing is, it has been very bad, and the bereaved and the families that have lost people, often quite unnecessarily, you know, if there had been stronger measures in place right at the outset, they are the ones who are bearing this awful burden of grief and loss, which is really not being sufficiently acknowledged. And, you know, at the first Christmas of the pandemic, in Christmas 2020, when some organisations went out of their way to do something, you know, to make a gesture, which remembered those who had died, like Eden Court Theatre in Inverness, put up a Christmas tree with a light for every person who had died in the Highland region, you know. And that became almost like a place of pilgrimage for people who had really nowhere to go to express their public sense of loss. And of course, now in London, there's that sort of wall of hearts in London, which people can visit. But that's been very informally done. You know, there's not a lot of public publicity about it or public commentary about it. And I was quite, you know, I was listening to a BBC News bulletin yesterday, and they did decide to mark the 150,000 deaths with a very poignant interview with a woman who had lost two close relatives, and you know, you just realised how little really of that kind of coverage there's been. Channel 4 News does quite a bit of it compared with some of the others, but you know, the scale of that loss and the fact that it's something like 4 times or at least 3 times as many civilians as were killed in Britain in the Second World War is something that is just not really registering. And I'm afraid it's not registering because too many people are protecting the reputation of this government. And, you know, I'm sorry to say that. There are plenty of good journalists who are not doing that. And there are probably journalists within quite right-leaning news organisations who would rather be doing a better job on it. But the mood is that people don't want to hear that. They want to hear that everything's fine and everything's going back to normal. And that's what Boris Johnson plays on, you know, and he's, I suppose, as Kaukab said, that this idea of not having free lateral flow tests anymore, partly to save money, obviously, and partly to give the signal that it's all over and you don't need to be doing that stuff anymore. Well, that's not what the numbers say. And it's particularly, I mean, I think one group that have been almost entirely marginalised in all this are the people who really cannot afford to take any risks with respiratory infections like this. You know, people who had to self-isolate right from the start, who are now having to do that at a time when everyone else is able to go out and about much more and are therefore being being disadvantaged in their work and in their social lives, much more than everyone else, and are already probably suffering from all the problems that go with poor health or disability, you know, that their incomes are probably affected and all the rest of it. And now they're simply being expected to carry the can for this government's wish to get everything back to normal for those who are big and tough and, you know, in the survival of the fittest, strong enough to take the risks associated with getting COVID. But there is quite a large section of the population that just can't take those risks and are being, you know, are being effectively exiled from society. And that's incredibly harsh. So, you know, I don't like the British government's tone on this. I prefer the tone of the Welsh and Scottish governments, who at least seem to be aware of all these human issues around it and of the scale of the tragedy that's taken place, and have by and large done a better job of mitigating it. I mean, there's been a lot of rows about the numbers, and I'm not an expert on the Welsh numbers, but I do know that if you want to be blunt about it, the death rate per million in Scotland has been lower than the death rate per million in the UK as a whole. And of course, that UK as a whole figure is dominated by the figures in England. So whatever you think of the management of the pandemic in both in all the jurisdictions of the UK, the fact is that in Scotland, and I think we can say probably also in Wales, some lives have been saved, real human lives, probably several hundred in each case, have been, or maybe even more, have been saved by the actions of those governments. So, you know, what can you say about that? Either you value human life or you don't.
Thank you, Joyce. That's a number of really important points that you make there, and inevitably I'm sure we could, especially with the amount of news we've had relating to COVID over the weekend, we could probably talk about it for at least an hour this afternoon. However, what we'll do is we'll move on to the next story, but I'm confident that we will come back to this because of the number and the importance of the impact, both nationally and, as you say, on individuals and their families. But we will move on to the next item now, which is that for some people, today is the day of Republika Srpska, which commemorates the founding of that republic 25 years ago. However, the holiday has been repeatedly banned by the Constitutional Court in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and this year the Vice President of the Republic Srpska, who's Ramiz Selkic, asked for those who were organising celebrations of the National Day to be prosecuted, and said that celebrating spreads religious and national hatred and intolerance towards non-Serb citizens. Now, you may well have seen recent examples of extreme Serb nationalism continuing to celebrate the convicted genocidal murderer Ratko Mladic, and also even celebrating the Christian Orthodox Christmas Eve on the 6th of January by singing "Shoot at the Mosques" in the town of Probij. So firstly, Joyce, coming to you, what's your reaction to the latest news we've heard from Serbia, from Republika Srpska, and what's your reaction, and what do you think the reaction of others and other countries should be?
Well, obviously, it's terribly distressing. I mean, it's 30 years now since that awful war broke out in Yugoslavia. It took, you know, a horrendous 5 years and great loss of life, certainly well into six figures, to bring that war to something like an end. I mean, it never really ended. It was a sort of ceasefire that was sort of formed into a kind of a rough political settlement, but it was a settlement that in some ways, like the Northern Ireland settlement, really kind of tolerated and to some extent exaggerated the differences between the various communities in order to make sure that they all had representation, which is a good goal in itself, but it tends to mean that you sort of form people into blocks, which can then form echo chambers for their own account of history. And so there's been a kind of failure in Bosnia, which had a strong element of all three national communities in former Yugoslavia, you know, the Croat one, the Bosnian sort of Muslim one, although in Yugoslav times, very few of those Bosnian Muslims were really practicing the Muslim faith very much, but they belonged to that community that was described as that. And then, of course, the Serbian Orthodox one, which not only celebrates its National Day this week, but as you've said, the Serbian Orthodox Christmas. So, so it's a really worrying situation. And what has happened in this Serbian enclave of Bosnia, the Republika Srpska, as it's known, which is very, very close to Sarajevo. I mean, it's just across the other side of the airport. I mean, it reminds you of Northern Ireland in the sense that it's all very intimate. You know, all these communities very close to each other, and probably quite heavily intermarried and interwoven at one time too. You know, it's not like they don't know each other really. And they, in the Republika Srpska, this kind of, as in Serbia or in some sections of Serbian politics up in Belgrade, this sort of culture of genocide denial and sort of self-pitying, sort of denial of what went on in the 1990s has really taken root in some sections of Serbian culture. And as you say, they make a hero of those that have been convicted of war crimes, particularly Ratko Mladic, the man held responsible for the Srebrenica genocide in 1995. And they won't come to terms with it. There's been very little coming to terms. And to some extent, that is reflected in the other communities. There's quite a lot of denialism in Croatia as well about what their forces got up to during the war and in Bosnia, but it's not really on the same scale. And the problem with the Serbian culture of sort of self-pity and denial is that Serbia is still one of the most powerful states of that small region, and has a big influence on everything that happens there. And secondly, that kind of self-pitying attitude from an Eastern Orthodox country, which has traditionally quite strong links to Russia, attracts the support of Vladimir Putin and all the kind of dark ops that his government gets up to. So he is probably, I would say, almost certainly, constantly encouraging this kind of anti-Western conspiracy theory type attitude in Serbia. And although everybody's been laughing and cracking jokes this week about the situation with Novak Djokovic not being allowed into Australia, if you look at the pronouncements that his father has been making, sort of making these Christ-like analogies of his son and saying everybody's out to get us, you know, this is the evil Western powers sort of cracking down on poor nations and nations that aren't part of their wonderful world, and being unfair and applying these human rights norms that they only apply to other people and never to themselves. I mean, a lot of criticisms which have a faint ring of truth, but are also, you know, quite wildly exaggerated in terms of seeing people like Djokovic as victims of all of this. That kind of rhetoric, sadly, is now very common in Serbia. So, you know, I just hope we're not looking at the situation where the whole Djokovic incident doesn't act as one of the triggers for yet more conflict. But I mean, it could. That's the kind of situation we're in now. It's all sort of on a hair trigger. I mean, there are questions to be asked about what anyone can do about this. Vladimir Putin's already creating almost impossible headaches for a peace-loving European Union along the Ukrainian border. He's now moving into Kazakhstan. He's already occupied and taken over Crimea, and now, with any excuse, I would say he'll be taking an interest in the situation in former Yugoslavia if that boils over into anything like a conflict. And really, the EU is probably trying to do various things, but I think unless it is going to be sort of left on the sidelines of history, it's going to have to get its act together much more decisively in sort of adopting a policy about this and working out how to deal with it along with other Western allies, because it's really a very serious situation now. And despite the weakness of Russia really as an economy now, it's still creating a huge amount of trouble and a huge amount of mischief. And it's using all of these 21st century tools like internet conspiracy theories and so on to sort of advance the attitudes that will support Russian influence all along that eastern edge of Europe. And, the West has been very slow to get to grips with that and to find ways of countering it, I'm afraid.
Absolutely right. Thank you, Joyce. And without making light of the situation at all, especially the situation in in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the notion that a multi-millionaire tennis player is Rosa Parks with a better forehand is frankly ridiculous. And I'm not trying to make light of the situation, but it does, I think, show how ridiculous it is. Kaukab, just turning to you for a moment. Joyce was talking there a little about the slightly more geopolitical aspects of this and the circumstances on a number of the borders of Russia. Joyce also made mention of how she saw images or mirrors or some similarity between the situation in Northern Ireland and certainly the peace settlement in Northern Ireland and the peace settlement, the Dayton Accord in Bosnia and Herzegovina. What do you think governments in Europe and elsewhere should be doing in response to the developments that we're seeing in Serbia? What could our government or the UK government do, and what should they be doing?
Well, I suppose the obvious bit to that is sanctions. I mean, that's always one element, and I know that the US has sort of put that out there, and the UK has sort of issued a statement that they support those sanctions. So that's one, but then you've got the carrot and the stick. But for long-term stability, it can only be through diplomacy. And that's the tricky one, because obviously, as Joyce has pointed out, there are so many different vested interests there, a very, very complicated and very volatile situation that not only is got one eye on the future, but also an eye on the past and a very complicated history. But that doesn't mean to say that we can't attempt it. And Joyce is again quite correct in the fact that the EU, I don't believe, has been robust enough or demanding enough to work with its allies to try and reach some kind of diplomatic solution to this, which will take time and quite high level sort of like negotiations, I would imagine, but surely it can't be beyond us. I mean, the bit around all this issue that strikes a chord with me particularly is the huge concern about the rise of far-right nationalism. And in sort of like Bosnia in particular, you know, it's really concerning to me that there seems to be a real threat for the sovereignty of Bosnia, which is there, and that is hugely concerning to the people who have not only suffered time and time again, but to have such an unstable future is just horrific. How can people plan for the future and just want to live normal lives and be free to practice their religions and their cultures in the way that they should be able to do? So that really does worry me, and we've got to guard against that threat. You know, they have a right to have a unified multi-ethnic state, which is what we should all be sort of heading towards.
Thank you, Kaukab. Well, what we'll do now is we'll come back to Scotland for our next story, and that's because at 12 noon on Friday past, the nuclear power station Hunterston B on the Clyde coast ceased operations and will not generate any further electricity using nuclear power. Now, in the reporting around that, I've certainly noticed that there have been arguments being put forward by the nuclear industry that electricity generated by nuclear power is less expensive than perhaps volatile fossil fuel prices are at the moment. But it struck me, Joyce, that how can you say that nuclear energy is cheaper than anything else when we frankly don't seem to have much of a firm idea about what the actual total lifetime costs of nuclear energy are. And I think the most advanced decommissioning in Scotland probably is at Dounreay, and I know that the current estimates suggest that may cost up to £70 billion, and that the site might be capable of use for anything other than a nuclear plant in perhaps 300 years' time. So why do you think that the nuclear industry is at a time when the amount of electricity generated by nuclear power has dropped in the UK to I think 8 gigawatts. At its peak it was something like 13 gigawatts in the 1990s. Why do you think the nuclear industry is apparently attempting a rearguard action by comparing itself to the use of fossil fuels?
Well, it's fighting for its life, obviously, against the sort of superior options now offered by all kinds of renewables. I mean, oddly, I think some elements of capitalism may be a beginning to ride to the rescue here in terms of putting the boot through some of these arguments. Because if you are looking for an investment in the future of energy, you know, and you have that kind of capital to invest, it's becoming ever more obvious that investing in renewables is a no-brainer. It's cheaper, it's quicker, you get the capacity up and running, you know, faster than any nuclear plant could possibly be built, um, and you um, and you get a kind of sustainable return far, far into the future. You know, there is no real lifetime. You know, as long as you maintain and replace the parts of your various, you know, turbines and wind farms or whatever it is you're using, this thing goes on forever. This is what we mean by sustainable energy. It's not just that it's sustainable in environmental terms, but it actually has no time limit, unlike any of the fossil fuel booms that we've had up to now. And it produces sustainable jobs. It produces jobs without any time limit, unlike mining or the oil industry. Or anything else. So it's actually very fast becoming obviously the best investment. And I mean, the Chinese government can see that, lots of people can see it. And that's why the phasing down, as we've got to see since the failure to get the word out into the phasing out into the COP26 agreement. But nonetheless, the phasing down of fossil fuels is not really controversial anymore. And the nuclear industry, I think, is just, it's fighting for its life. It's trying to maintain some kind of nuclear capacity because that's what it knows and what it has expertise in. Certainly, there are appealing things about nuclear power. I mean, it does produce a lot of power through a kind of almost magical process, and it's greener in terms of the actual moment of power production, obviously, than fossil fuels are. But the cost of building and then decommissioning nuclear plants is absolutely colossal. I mean, it is huge, and I really think that it's just so 20th century. It's not the technology that is going to deliver either a viable future for us all, or indeed the best business prospects in the 21st century. And of course, they're all panicking. They're trying to make weaselly arguments, just like the oil industry is, for opening up new fields and all the rest of it. But fundamentally, they're basically very ill-founded, those arguments now. And I think the smart money, as it were, if you want to put it crudely, will be moving very fast towards renewables, particularly in Scotland, which has so much potential in renewables and such a vast potential capacity there.
Absolutely. Thank you, Joyce. Hold on to that thought about the 20th century, because I'll come back to you about it in a moment. But firstly, Kaukab, the Scottish Government set its Scottish energy strategy back in 2017, and at that time, even at that time, said nuclear power represents poor value for the consumer, and so made clear opposition from the Scottish Government to any further nuclear power plants in Scotland. But thinking of what we've learned and what we've read and we've heard since COP26, and in the context of the Scottish energy strategy, do you think the Scottish Government has the necessary powers and levers to take the steps that the Scottish energy strategy sets out? And if the Scottish Government doesn't have those levers and those powers, what do you think we should do about it?
Joyce has made quite important points there, and I think you're right to refer to the Scottish Energy Strategy, which was published, I think, in December 2017. And you're right to say that it confirmed its opposition to no nuclear, new nuclear power stations under the current technologies. Now, of course, technologies are changing all the time, but as we can see, the momentum of change for technologies is towards renewables. We're looking at sort of like the storage of that, hydrogen and carbon capture, which obviously we think, the Scottish Government thinks that that's the best pathway to achieving the net zero targets for 2045. And with COP26, which was here in Glasgow, Kelvin, not that long ago, are we already starting to forget the momentum that built up at that time. There was a great clamour for it, and the clamour at that time was for action. And I suppose this is part of that action journey. And whenever decisions are made to take concrete actions, there is a fight back from that. So Joyce is right in the fact that the nuclear sort of power industry are fighting for their lives, but we're looking ahead to our future that's more secure, that's more sustainable with regards to renewable energy. So from that point of view, that is, it's going to be difficult. A lot of the concerns I hear are to do with jobs. And I always sort of like pitch the bit about upskilling and reskilling. And that has been part of the message that's come out from the Scottish Government about having a just transition. Because it's not a cliff edge, you know, you're not going to wake up sort of like, you know, one morning and all the jobs are going to disappear. That transition has already started. People are already starting to go into those industries. And I would argue that those more renewable ways like wind, for also wave energy, there's amazing work that's going on to capture that and turn it into energy. Those jobs are starting to come online, and in education as well. There's been a huge sort of rise in the courses that are available and the research and development that's taking place in our universities and industries across Scotland. So I'm quite sort of like optimistic, and I choose to be sort of like quite hopeful about that because it's more positive and more greener from that point of view. With regards to the levers, obviously we don't have all the levers that we need because we're not able to raise our own money into investing in renewables as much as we like. We have a finite budget which we need to prioritise. So it does come down to money, unfortunately, and having different priorities up here in order to prioritise the way that we want to see our renewables go.
Thank you, Kaukab. Now, Joyce, very briefly, I did say hold on to that thought about the 20th century because I was going to ask you very briefly what you thought was behind the apparent love for the nuclear industry that the UK governments of both red and blue hues have expressed and continue to express. And I wondered, is it in some way a Westminster-based cultural hangover or a determination to continue to view the world through the prism of the 1950s and the 1960s?
Well, of course, there's the kind of traditional association between nuclear technology and sort of military might and security and all that. You know, if you've got a well-developed nuclear industry, it means that you can, if you want, enrich uranium and all that stuff. You know, and you can see how controversial that is in relation to Iran and so on at the moment. That, you know, it's a sort of mark of national power if you're dealing in that kind of macho global power politics to have that technology and to be able to do it. But the fact is, you know, you could keep small facilities that were able to do that without having any major nuclear input into your energy industry. So I think it's just a matter of great big traditional vested interests being kowtowed to. And I must say, since I'm not, unlike Kaukab, I'm not a member of the SNP and don't have to agree with them about everything, I think there is still quite a strong element within the SNP who are sentimental and wedded to the idea of big oil and oil power. And if you say anything like, you know, let's not do the Cambo oil field on any of the social media, you will get a pile-on from a certain group of independent supporters who see that as a kind of threat to the sort of virility, if you like, of the national movement. You know, the oil for that generation of SNP supporters who were young in the 1970s, oil was the kind of symbol of Scotland's potential power and sort of macho presence on the world stage, and they're struggling to let go of that oil and gas culture now. Hence, I think the exaggerated emphasis in SNP policy on carbon capture, which is actually a very poorly developed technology and doesn't offer great prospects for the future at the moment. I mean, it could improve by leaps and bounds, of course, as technologies do. But I think SNP ministers for the last decade or so have been placing too much emphasis on that rather than focusing on the swift shift to renewables, which really offers the best future for Scotland. And, you know, there are sentimental and 20th century reasons for that as well. So I think we all kind of have to check our attachments to various kinds of old technologies and the reasons for them. And, you know, the fact is that you know, the labour movement was totally wedded to the sort of coal boom, really, of the late 19th century. You know, the big labour forces, workforces that emerged from that, who were unionised and then developed into the Labour Party. There was this huge attachment to the coal industry and everything it represented, which reached its crisis during the miners' strike of 1984. The SNP is very attached to the oil technologies of the later 20th century because of that, what that potentially meant for Scotland's wealth, but that never came to pass. And I really think we're onto a better thing if we attach ourselves now to renewable energies, which have a sort of non-finite future and do far less damage to our you know, the earth, which is our home.
Thank you, Joyce. And if anyone's in any doubt whatsoever, it is 2022, and on Broadcasting Scotland, we are in the 21st century. But we'll move on to our next story now, which is Johnson leaving families in the cold over Tory cost of living crisis because of a triple whammy of Tory cuts, taxes and inflation, which is hammering family budgets. Ian Blackford MP, the SNP's Westminster leader, has said that the Prime Minister has failed to lift a finger to reverse the crisis caused by a toxic concoction of Tory cuts, tax hikes, soaring inflation and energy bills. The SNP Westminster leader warned the majority of families will be worse off in 2022 unless the UK government introduces an emergency package of support, including a low-income energy payment, matching the Scottish Child Payment across the UK, reversing the £20 a week cut to universal credit, and raising the minimum wage and statutory sick pay to the real living wage of £9.90 an hour. That comes as a survey from the Office of National Statistics found that 2/3 of people said their cost of living had increased in the last month. Of those, a quarter said they were being forced to dip into their savings to cover increased costs, and the same proportion said they had cut back on essentials, including shopping for food. So during the week, Torsten Bell, who's the chief executive of the Resolution Foundation, said 2022 will begin with Omicron at the forefront of everyone's minds, but while the economic impact of this new wave is uncertain, it should at least be short-lived. Instead, 2022 will be defined as the year of the squeeze. The overall picture is likely to be one of prices surging and pay packets stagnating. In fact, real wages have already started falling and are set to go into next Christmas barely higher than they are now. The peak of the squeeze will be in April, he said, as families face a £1,200 income hit from soaring energy bills and tax rises. So large is this overnight cost of living catastrophe that it's hard to see how the government avoids stepping in. So, Kaukab, it struck me that in this context, and with this story, we're seeing lower income families being particularly hard hit by the steep increases in energy prices. We may see families which are on higher incomes, and particularly if they're in employment, being impacted and struck by the increase in national insurance. Whilst unsurprisingly, perhaps one might say that the asset-owning classes are not so significantly affected. So, thinking of the politics of this for a minute, how secure do you think the Tory former Red Wall seats? How do you think voters and the new Tory MPs representing those constituencies, how do you think they'll be feeling come April?
Well, deeply uncomfortable, I hope. And of course, we've got council elections coming up in May. So there's implications there because a lot of the austerity cuts and the lack of money, a lot of provision is obviously provided at council level as well. So councils are going to have to find more money. And in Scotland, of course, we cannot just find more money because we have the Barnett formula. So there is a limited amount of money. And if that is redirected yet again to mitigate sort of Tory cuts, we used to call them austerity cuts, and now we're looking at the cost of living crisis. So there's a theme here with the Conservative policies, really. But this one is even more concerning because, as you have pointed out, not only does it sort of hit the poorest, which in my opinion, you won't be surprised to know that a lot of the Tory policies do impact on the poorest in our society disproportionately, but it's actually covering people who work as well. So that phrase of the working poor, that has always been there, but that category is now going to be even more expanded, especially at a time when the nation is feeling vulnerable anyway, trying to recover and look towards the future, coming out of the COVID pandemic, hopefully, at some point. So from that point of view, they should, I mean, in my opinion, they should be deeply ashamed of themselves. And from a Scottish point of view, it's such a difficult situation for the government on, if they try, I mean, obviously we sort of like dealt with the universal credit and double that, protected that. However, we cannot keep using money to mitigate Tory cuts and impacts on families, because at some point that money that can be redirected to mitigate those is going to have to come from somewhere else. And I mean, certainly at the Scottish Parliament, I do hear my Conservative colleagues are often saying, we need more money for this, we need more money for that, but they never actually turn around and say where that money needs to come from. What would they cut? So you can't just keep criticising and not actually offering like concrete, viable sort of alternatives. But of course, it's a tale of two, things here. We have different priorities up here. We're trying to deal with sort of like health policy, social policy, making sure we leave nobody behind. I mean, to me, that does mean something. Whereas, trying to constantly go up against a Conservative government that's doing the polar opposite of that. So to me, this is all sort of like reinforcing, I think, that actually, to me, it's a no-brainer, as an independent nation to have full control over all of our levers, that we can set our own priorities and protect our own sort of like societies and people from the worst excesses of this cost of living crisis that's coming.
Thank you, Kaukab. And we'll move on now. And Joyce, I'll come to you first for our final item this afternoon, because you'll maybe have noticed that Sir Keir Starmer is on the front page of at least one newspaper in Scotland today. Now, I've read the interview several times, and he's quoted as saying, My strong view is that decisions about people should be made as close to them as possible. He then said that the status quo, he described it as, the status quo approach to Scotland cannot continue. He said, I will wait for Gordon, meaning Gordon Brown, to finish his piece of work to answer your question in full, because obviously there are huge issues bound up with any question of fiscal devolution. But he said the general principle works, but we cannot defend the status quo. Now, as I say, Joyce, I read this interview several times. What do you think he means? I can't work it out.
Well, I don't know what he means, and I wonder whether he knows what he means, really. I've never seen any sign in Keir Starmer's pronouncements on devolution that he really fully understands the situation, or that he's ever given enough thought to Scottish politics to develop a very interesting approach to it. I mean, it'll be interesting to see what Gordon Brown comes out with this time, in the sense that Gordon Brown is, whatever, a lot of people in Scotland have had enough of him, obviously, but he's not a fool. He lives in Scotland. He observes Scottish politics very closely, and it's so if his thinking has evolved at all since 2014, it'll be interesting to see what that amounts to, and also how well he is able, if it does amount to anything, to convey that to the rest of the Labour Party and the rest of the UK, which traditionally, and certainly back in the 1990s when we were campaigning for devolution, was really not interested at all. It was very hard to get any attention for what was going on. And when devolution was finally enacted in 1998, and put into practice in 1999, it was still the case that most Labour MPs down south had absolutely no idea what was happening, and were in some cases really shocked to realise the extent of the devolution that had been agreed, and also the extent of the proportional representation that had been agreed for the Scottish Parliament. They just didn't know about it, and they didn't know about it because they weren't interested enough to monitor what was going on. And I'm afraid that is still the case with a lot of Westminster politicians, not only Conservative ones, but Labour ones. And so we've got Keir Starmer holding forth on Scottish politics. I mean, what struck me about that interview, apart from these sort of, kind of vague things about the status quo is not an option, I really don't know what he means by that. I mean, frankly, I think a lot of Scots who were in favour of devolution and not in favour of independence would be happy if they felt the status quo could be protected from, raids on Holyrood's power by an increasingly sovereigntist Westminster government that's no longer constrained in any way by membership of the European Union. I mean, I think that would come as a relief to some. So I don't really know what Keir Starmer's talking about there, but he again uses this line of Nicola Sturgeon has the wrong focus because she spends all of her time thinking about constitutional issues. Now, nobody who actually pays any attention to Scottish politics could possibly think that. You know, it is absolutely not the case about Nicola Sturgeon that she spends all her time thinking about constitutional issues. Indeed, she is constantly under severe criticism from many people in the independence movement for not spending enough time thinking about constitutional issues or indeed acting on them. Instead, she is trying to be the First Minister of Scotland in one of the most difficult situations in terms of a public health crisis that has arisen this century. And, you know, anyone who makes that accusation about Nicola Sturgeon is not paying attention and doesn't actually know what he's talking about. And I think the failure of the Labour Party to even understand what the modern SNP is absolutely critical to their failure on this issue, and they will continue to fail until they stop demonising the SNP and start recognising it as an alternative social democratic party, which, whatever its shortcomings, has done better at defending Scottish social democracy than they have. And that's the secret of the SNP's success, and they will not and can't understand that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Joyce. And Kaukab, thinking about this a little bit further, Keir Starmer's obviously had a busy week, notwithstanding his testing positive for COVID. And I'm thinking in particular of his, how can I describe it, flag rack speech earlier this week. And it struck me that it was becoming pretty clear that the British Labour Party really doesn't care about Scotland at all. And that perhaps the interview in the Scotland on Sunday this morning was a vague attempt at tartan washing in order to keep Ian Murray happy, and that was about the size of it. But do you think, is it fair to say that in the context of British Labour Party's focus on attempting to recover red wall seats, former red wall seats, that the Labour Party is, and Keir Starmer is focused entirely on that, and Scotland is now irrelevant to the British Labour Party?
Well, yeah, you can see that from their point of view, because I mean, even if they won sort of like all the seats in Scotland, they still wouldn't be able to get a majority unless the focus was on getting those seats down in England. So from their point of view, I can see that logic. But you're right in the fact that I don't believe that they do care, but they want to be seen to be caring. So it's that kind of paternalistic attitude that they have, is like, you know, you're not, we are thinking of you, you're right at the center of our thoughts, but actually the reason for that to me is that, and Joyce sort of expressed it very well, and I'd take it a wee bit further, and I would say that actually for the Labour Party, they're more concerned with sort of like attacking and having a go at the SNP for the fact that it is the SNP, rather than actually presenting a positive vision to the public about what they think Scottish politics and policies should be. And they don't have that. You know, their whole strategy just seems to be based on that kind of negative, attacking, disruptive, invective that they use, and it doesn't resonate with the Scottish public. I mean, I speak to lots of people who are frankly quite put off with that kind of thing. It's not a healthy debate. There's no constructive sort of alternatives that are given, and they can, in Scotland certainly, they cannot admit that the only way to sort of like protect Scotland, we were talking about it earlier from my point of view, sort of very toxic Tory policies, is for Scotland to have the full powers of a normal independent country. And for Scottish Labour, it's very difficult because they want to be unique, but they are tied so heavily to Keir Starmer's Labour Party that they are in fact the same, even though they try to be distinctive. If they were distinctive, they would acknowledge the democratic right and the will of the Scottish people to to be independent or to have the question put to us. But they cannot do that. And they are so focused on it. With regards to sort of Nicola being sort of, being obsessed with the constitutional question, I mean, yes, she does actually get a lot of criticism. There is a big demand, especially as we recover out of COVID, independence for recovery, that as an independent nation, we could recover better. That debate is out there. So the demand to get us moving through the programme for government, and she did say that we would, and I think the work has already, in fact, I know that the work has already started to get the next referendum sort of on the table. But it is possible for a modern nation and a devolved parliament to actually think about more than one thing at a time. There are lots of people there. There is a big cabinet. There's lots of work that goes on, and we're all able to multitask and think about many things. And let's face it, they're all intrinsically linked. If you're looking at funding for one, that is linked to a policy for something else. And again, if social policy and health policy is your priorities, then you need all the levers to do that. It's sort of, it's quite interesting. To me, it's just constitutional tinkering around the edges. They can see the writing on the wall. They can see the general trend. So many things have changed over the last few years, and certainly since we had the last referendum, that nobody can say that we are in that position. The whole nation has moved on, and to have that democratic right to put that question back under this context, I think is important. And Labour can't recognise that. And until they do, I don't think that they are going to make any breakthroughs. They're seeing apologists for Keir Starmer's Labour Party up in Scotland, and they don't have any viable alternatives.
Thank you, Kaukab. And that was our final item this afternoon. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the financial support of viewers and others who value our distinctive independent approach to news, culture and current affairs. If you would like to support us financially, and we really need that support, then please consider donating or subscribing to Broadcasting Scotland, and you can do that at the link which is on the screen now. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras or in any other way that supports the work of the station, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. I'd like to say very many thanks to both Joyce and Kaukab for their time and their contributions and their thoughts this afternoon. Kaukab, Joyce, thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks so much.
I'd also like to say thanks to everybody for joining us here on the Full Scottish today. I hope that you enjoyed a tasty Full Scottish with us. We will be here again tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock with Scotland at 7, so please join us again then. But in the meantime, please keep warm and keep well. Bye-bye.